Okay, I think we'll go ahead and start. Welcome to everybody. This is our virtual book launch for the new book that came out this spring, Color in the Ancestral Pueblo Southwest. It's edited by Marit, Munson, and Kelley Hays-Gilpin. And I wanted to just give you, my name is Reba Rausch. I'm the acquisitions editor for the press. And helping me today is Hannah New, the marketing manager for the press. The format for the presentation will be, I'm going to introduce the speakers. We have 3 of the book authors and 1 of the book reviewers. They'll each talk about the book for a short time, and then we will go to questions and answers. Feel free to use the chat function to ask any questions you may have. Once we get to questions and answers, Hannah will pick that up and she will ask the questions to the authors. We will try to get through as many as we can. We're hoping to keep this to an hour. All right, our first speaker today will be Marit Munson. She's an anthropological archaeologist at Trent University in Ontario, Canada. Her PhD research was done at the University of New Mexico and focused on rock art in the northern Rio Grande Valley of New Mexico. In addition to her work on rock art and on membrane ceramic imagery, she recently published a book on archaeological approaches to art, artists, and audiences titled The Archaeology of Art in the American Southwest. Our second speaker, also these are the 2 volume editors, is Kelley Hays-Gilpin. She's a professor and chair of anthropology at Northern Arizona University and curator of anthropology at the Museum of Northern Arizona. Her PhD dissertation at the University of Arizona focused on the earliest decorated pottery in the Four Corners area and compared pottery to textiles, basketry, rock art, and other media. She has studied ancestral Puebloan artwork for over 30 years, focusing especially on pottery, rock art, and mural painting of the ancestral Hopi. The third speaker will be David Witt, also an author. He's an archaeologist serving as Indian Nations Affairs Coordinator or the Tribal Liaison with the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation. Since 2015, he has been responsible for overseeing consultation between the agency and 12 indigenous nations. He earned his PhD in anthropology in 2015 from the University of Buffalo, where he is currently a research associate professor. And our last speaker is Will Russell. He is a senior archaeologist with Logan Simpson, specializing in tribal collaboration. His research focuses on social inequality, religion, and ritual in the pre-Hispanic Southwest. Will is an adjunct professor with Arizona State University and a research associate of the Center for Archaeology and Society. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn this over to Marit Munson to let her speak with you.
Thank you, Reba, and thanks everyone for joining us today. We're all here because we're interested in color in one fashion or another. And that's a bit ironic because most of us tend to think about the past as being in black and white. Maybe some earth tones, but nothing too exciting. And I think that's in part because archaeological reports have been illustrated in black and white for the last century and a half. And we see a lot of images like the one that should be on your screen right now of Walter Fuchs at Mesa Verde in 1910. A lot of these images are presenting archaeology as if what we do is excavate in grayscale, preferably under the leadership of white men. And there is a very long-standing bias in Western thought against color. It's pretty common to see color as being superficial or frivolous, maybe childish even, certainly nothing that a serious scientist would be interested in considering. Now, in reality, the past was much more like this. It was full of color. And these were colors chosen with purpose and sometimes a great deal of effort to convey information and evoke emotions. These were colors chosen to carry complex meanings and to make things beautiful. So my co-authors and I wanted to know more about how ancestral Pueblo people in the Southwest used color what choices they made, and then especially what those choices might tell us about the past. To begin with, we needed to understand how color worked in the days before our super customized, chemically colored world. So I started looking into the curious history of color thinking, which is far more convoluted than you might imagine, as well as some of the practical and technical aspects of pigments and paints. This research really highlighted for me the importance of using published records and museum collections to research rare or unusual items. For example, there might be one excavation report that would record finding domed pestles covered in a green copper-based paint, whereas another report might mention what looks like the quick use of a handy piece of stone to grind a bit of red ochre. But we really can't see the broader patterns behind this in terms of how people use different tools and materials and processes to create color. We can't see those patterns until we draw together many different sources of information. So that's what we wanted to do with this book. We wanted to survey Ancestral Pueblo use of color across the Southwest through time and space, and to consider media ranging from wall paintings and rock art to ceramics and ornaments. So as Reba mentioned, Kelley, Hays-Gilpin, and Dave Witt will tell you a bit more about their research in a few minutes. But first I wanted to touch on a couple of common themes that emerged from our work on this book. In addition to the things that we discuss in the book itself, we also highlight several different areas of potential for future research, and I'm happy to talk about those more later as well. The first big lesson for us, though, is that as archaeologists, we really haven't been that great about recording color systematically. So when we do record color, like the paints and pigments on these tools here that you see on the left, or the paint and pigment samples from archaeological sites on the right. When we record these kinds of colors, if we do in our reports, we usually rely on the Munson color system. And that's the very familiar soil color charts that all archaeologists know that you see on the left-hand side of this screen. And using a Munson system, this piece of pigment from Pueblo del Arroyo in Chaco Canyon would probably be considered to be 5YR7/8, a color term that is intelligible only to archaeologists, and that is officially considered in the Munson system to be reddish yellow. Well, that's a pretty arbitrary designation. It's one that's useful for archaeologists when speaking to each other, but it's missing a lot. It's a very simple and very limited way of thinking about color. And we know, for example, that in the Zuni language, some color terms have to do with the intrinsic color of objects, like calling this piece of pigment red, perhaps, while other color terms are more verb-based, and they're more about the process of becoming a color. So we need to recognize that colors may be meaningful, in part because of how they change, either how they change during their production or how they change in use. Second lesson that we learned through this volume is that specific colorful materials may be important not only for their hue, or what we would think of colloquially as color, but also because of their particular geographic origins and the efficacy and animacy of those materials. In other words, what they can do. At the site of Hamalabi, for example, in Arizona, pigments and paints that may look like they're the same color, they may look to be the identical color of red, may be used in quite different ways because they are different materials with different properties and therefore different powers. So we can't assume that all red is red. And then finally, we want to highlight the fact that archaeologists shouldn't expect to discover some kind of stable universal meaning for a given color. We can suggest that white clay smeared on cliff faces might be related to prayers for rain, or that black terraces might represent storm clouds heavy with moisture. But above all, we need to recognize that color symbolism is flexible and multifaceted. It's sensitive to context, it's full of poetic nuance, and that's one of the reasons why people use color the way that they do. So although we can't get at specific meanings of color in the past, one of the things that I think we accomplish in this book is to show how colorful materials were very deeply meaningful for ancestral Pueblo people all across the Southwest. And I'll ask Kelley Hays-Gilpin to then, sorry, just one second. I'll ask Kelley Hays-Gilpin if she'll share with us some of the lessons that she learned about ceramics and pottery in the Southwest in terms of color.
Unmute. Thanks for inviting me into this project. And I also want to thank my chapter co-author, Jill Neitzel, who got me organized enough to do this. I've been working on Ancestral Pueblo pottery for so long, I really didn't know where to start. And so this chapter came about partly through a process of Jill interrogating me in a really organized and expert way. And together we got a chapter done on pottery. So what I want to do in a few slides is explain a little bit about pottery colors in the Ancestral Pueblo area. And I want to thank the Northern Arizona University, the former Department of Scientific Illustration here, the lab that did a lot of the photos you'll be seeing and that you see in the book. It got disbanded due to budget cuts, but they did some really amazing things with artifact photography, together with the Museum of Northern Arizona and National Park Service. And I'll have a few slides from the Dallas Museum of Art as well, which has a really amazing pottery collection. So how does pottery get its color? The color mainly results from how much iron you've got in the pottery, in the clay that you're selecting to make pottery, and any additional clays that you add to the surface or paints that you add to the surface. The amount of oxygen in the air that the pottery is exposed to when you fire it, and the firing temperature. So between about AD 800 and 1300, Ancestral Pueblo potters were making three color schemes. There's your, I don't know if my cursor comes through, but you have your gray corrugated cooking pots or utility ware that are decorated with texture, but no added color. Then you've got your black on white pottery that's fired under the ground with very little oxygen and selecting for low iron clays or slips, and redware pottery, which can be black on red, or in this case, black and red on an orange surface. And this is called a polychrome when you have more than two colors. So in a number of areas in the Southwest, including the Kayenta branch area or ancestral Hopi area, as well as the ancestral Zuni and Acoma areas in Western New Mexico, you have communities producing both black on white pottery and redware pottery, first black on red and then polychromes. And we think there's a lot of significance to these basic color schemes. So where we don't know the symbolism, there's no key or code to what each color means. We think that the colors were meaningful, and we can use ethnography and comparison with other media to get close to some of those meanings or how they're meaningful. So the black on white pottery, usually, at least always in the ancestral Hopi and Zuni area, seems to refer to textiles. Up in the Mesa Verde area, it may be more about coiled basketry, but which is still a kind of textile industry in a way. So they're the kinds of designs that were made in weaving. And in the case of the black and white textiles from the Hopi area, we're really looking at loom woven cotton textiles and a lot of very interesting, intricate textile techniques that are being depicted in the pottery. And cotton itself represents clouds and rain ethnographically in contemporary Pueblos. So I'm hypothesizing that the black on white pottery was referring to clouds, rain, moisture, and weaving. So this one on the right here looks like it's depicting a brocade technique. And that's still used in Pueblo textiles today, mainly at Hopi. So you have the basic plain weave cotton textile, and they're weaving in a supplemental warp. And today there's a lot of embroidery using these designs, and you get this kind of negative patterning effect. So this is similar to what was being depicted on those pots from hundreds of years earlier. Then we've got our polychromes, which are usually black and red and orange to start out with a little bit of white sometimes. And the designs here are completely different in the Kayenta area, and they look more like plated basketry, like the sifter baskets that you use for parching corn and preparing and serving a lot of kinds of food. And then in the White Mountains area, the ancestral Zuni area, you have an almost glazed paint that starts to get shiny and glassy. And this is a very rare example of a combined black on red and black on white on the same vessel. So usually it's separate vessels with more whiteware jars in this area and redware bowls. So I think we have a kind of a sky and earth opposition or dynamic duality going on with the color schemes of pottery right up to about the early 1300s. And then we get a big change in the Hopi area. So we're now getting yellowware pottery, and this is low iron clay, but fired above ground with oxygen and with coal. And so we're getting a higher firing temperature. We're getting a lot of oxygen in the atmosphere, a high firing temperature with a low iron clay, and this brilliant yellow color is the result with black to brown iron manganese paint, and then the addition of red by the late 1300s, and eventually white. And we've got flowers and birds and clouds, nice cloud terrace here. So all kinds of symbolism that still can be interpreted today by Hopi potters and cultural specialists. And here's one of my favorite pieces from the San Francisco Fine Arts Museum, the de Young Museum, that shows two girls based on their hairstyles with a black and white tie-dyed blanket. And there are examples of tie-dye in the archaeological record, very rare, but an interesting juxtaposition here of polychrome and black and white in the same vessel, and a very clear textile referent with the tassels at the ends. We know that's a woven blanket there. So in the Sikyatki polychrome and the pottery of the 1400s and early 1500s in the Hopi area especially, we get a lot of sky imagery, a lot of flower imagery, katsinas, the spirit beings associated with summer and the agricultural season, start to show up. They're all about rain and all the good things in life. And today those katsinas are singing songs in dances in the plaza every early summer until the rains come. And they use words in those katsina songs that refer to color. And one of those words is sitala, which means the light shining from a field of yellow flowers. And it takes forms as Marit explained, the color terms are often more like verbs or processes or becoming, and this word is combined with other words. So you'll have words like sitalpuva, along the land shining with flowers, or through the land shining with flowers. Sakwatala is the light shining from a green field, especially a cornfield. And that's a beautiful sight. The flowers blooming means it's been raining, your corn is growing, and you're going to have a really beautiful, abundant harvest. And what you'll see up at Hopi today is potters making a revival style, the Sikyatki revival pottery style. You may have heard of the Hopi Tewa potter Nampeo, who worked around 1900 and made pottery and demonstrations at the Grand Canyon. And she revived this older style of pottery from the 1400s. So this is still going on today, all of these things that we've just been talking about. So I'm going to hand over to Will Russell. And I want to thank everybody for being here.
Hi. Thank you guys. I really appreciate being invited today. And I'm, like Marit said, I'm not an author, but I was asked to review the book and was extremely impressed. At that time, Sarah Clausen and I were doing some work on color, and I thought it was going to be somewhat rare. And then I got an email saying, hey, can you review this entire book on color? And it's just extraordinary. I think the work that's done here really steps outside of the box, and it's something that archaeology needs. I think a lot of archaeologists are stuck to some extent back in the old new archaeology days where, you know, like Marit said, looking at Munsell colors and quantifying things. And it's really refreshing to see new innovative research that combines ethnography with the archaeological record and looks at questions that are important to the descendant communities as well as the academia. So congratulations, it's a wonderful book. And it's something that I see, you know, for generations to come. People are going to be referencing this book and, you know, using the methodologies and the insight that come with it for their own research, myself included. So, thank you.
And I think we jumped over Dave for a minute. So we wanted to hear a little bit from Dave about his chapter with Jill Neitzel about color and ornaments. Dave?
Okay. Just get things set up. Everything going through okay? So, you know, first, thank you for setting this up. This has been very, you know, it's been a great work, and I loved working with everyone involved on this topic and bringing out more of a post-processualist look on things, as well as stating. So Jill and I had examined ancestral Puebloan ornaments through a lens of artifact life history, which is a particularly apt method due to the animism of both jewelry and raw material. We argue that the concepts of raw being and made being, ideas relating to the essence, the life essence and spirit inherent within certain objects, apply to the stone, shell, and other materials used in jewelry, offerings, and as Kelley discussed in her chapters, even some paints. Because these items had and continue to have animacy, a biography of jewelry is particularly enlightening. So the biographical stages that we explore are raw material, crafting, adornment, and finally ritual deposition. While this is an idealized sequence, it highlights how the personhood of ornament shifts through an object's lifetime. Starting as raw material, as a raw being, the item is transformed to a made being through crafting. We believe that the nature of the made being is dependent upon the myriad meanings and relationships present in the raw material and is strengthened during each stage of its life history. And here comes my cat. When ornaments were used for adornment, either of people or of structures, they contributed to the event and individual in a very real and active sense. Similarly, they use their offerings, the use as offerings added to the sacredness of events, including the burial of individuals and of the opening and closing of ritual spaces. In our chapter, we show how these specific patterns change through time. Blackstone, which included varieties of slate, jet, and shell, was primarily used as the secondary contrasting color through the pre-contact era, but gained importance during the Pueblo III and IV periods, particularly in burial contexts throughout the Southwest. And likewise, redstone, particularly red argillite, seems to have been a secondary color used throughout history. While shell and stone were used throughout the pre-contact period, the use of turquoise is a signature of the Chalcoan era. We argue that its use as high-status jewelry and burial offerings signifies a qualitative difference between Chaco and what came before, being used as a status indicator of the elite families who impacted the lives of others throughout the Colorado Plateau. These signify what we stated in the book as a different kind of society. After Chacoan's hegemony faded during the early Pueblo III, the use of turquoise may illustrate the legacy of Chacoan influence, such as at Rej Ruin and certain ancestral Zuni sites. However, as Jill and I say, while the sacred meanings and animating spirits associating with blue-green turquoise endured, the emphatic power symbolism that the color and material acquired during Chaco's heyday did not. In the absence of elite-based hierarchy, these messages were no longer relevant. Within these broad trends, ornaments were almost always a mix of colors and raw materials. We argue that this co-occurrence was also significant, though for additional reasons than just the nature of made beings. When worn, a small number of secondary or tertiary colors could signal identity and convey information about societal roles, cultural identity, and likely more. However, we must keep in mind that the materials often displayed many different hues. Shell was more than just white, turquoise was more than just blue-green, and color was more than just flat hue. Certain materials had a lustrous or metallic sheen, such as galena, mother of pearl, and lignite, or also known as jet. These sheens and hues may have also been meaningful, and our terminology as archaeologists admittedly obscures this considerable variation that may have been important to ancestral Puebloan people. Now, this brief overview of the chapter shows how meaningful these materials were in the past. However, we fully admit that our understanding of jewelry's sacred context has its limits, not only because of the absence of written records, but because while we can talk about how shell and turquoise and stone was animated, fully comprehending what this means from an emic perspective is a challenge for those not from Puebloan communities. Still, these constraints do not diminish the potential that this line of inquiry has for expanding our knowledge and appreciation of the Aztec Pueblo world, or ancestral Puebloan world. And I think I will then send it back to Marit, I believe.
Thanks, Dave. So that's a little bit from 3 of the authors of the book, as well as from Will Russell, one of our reviewers, who we greatly appreciate. And then I believe we'll turn it back to Reba and to Hannah from the press for questions.
Yes, Hannah's going to ask some questions that have come in on chat.
Great, thank you, Reba. The first one is, were petroglyphs commonly painted?
I'll start that one. With some definitions, if you don't know, petroglyphs is what archaeologists usually call rock engravings or textured, carved or incised images in rock surfaces, and they'll often use the term pictographs for rock paintings. And oddly enough, you don't usually get both techniques together. So if something's carved in, you don't see paint in it, and some of that might be due to weathering, but it might also be another one of these interesting dynamic dualities that we see in Pueblo culture. But there are some really cool painted petroglyphs on Perry Mesa where our colleague Will Russell works, and I wonder if Will would take a minute to describe a couple of those.
Yeah, we were really pleasantly surprised to run across those on survey. Along the eastern edge of Perry Mesa, there's a huge concentration of rock art there, and actually quite a few of them, mostly elk petroglyphs, do still have remnants of red paint on them. There's also a small rock shelter with an amazing petroglyph of 2 macaws facing each other.
Wow.
Probably about 40 centimeters tall, and one of those is painted red. And then below them, lower is a set of like baby macaws. So yeah, you do run into it. I mean, those ones on Perry Mesa are the only ones I've personally run across, but just spectacular. I know some people have hypothesized that maybe descendant communities are still going there and reapplying paint.
So would
I
those
don't
be
know.
Yavapai people, the
Yeah,
descendant community from
potentially.
that area? Yavapai?
Yeah, and I haven't heard that from them, but just people thinking out loud.
Mhm.
It doesn't. None of the ones I've seen look terribly fresh. So, to me it looks consistent with pre-Hispanic pictographs I've seen elsewhere in the Southwest.
Thanks.
And if I can just jump in for a minute, this is an example of one of the places where we need people to start looking for and documenting the patterns that are out there, because it's true that it's uncommon to see petroglyphs with paint on them. But I think anyone who's been in the field very much can think of one or two examples, or at least a small handful of examples. And what would be really interesting would be to know which images, or images of what, or what kinds of designs tend to get painted. The ones that I've seen in the Rio Grande Valley in New Mexico that have paint on them have typically been 4-pointed stars that have red paint on them. So, it'd be interesting to see what that patterning looks like through time and space in terms of the combination of paint and petroglyphs. So someone could pick that up.
Great. And if any participants have a question, feel free to enter it into the chat function. The next one, can you discuss the subjectivity of color, color vision, and effects such as optical blue in rock art?
Okay, I can take this one. When I started working on color, I realized that I would have to define what color was, which sounds very straightforward, because we all know what it is. It's red, yellow.
Not anymore.
Yeah, not anymore, we don't. And it's interesting to me to realize how there is consensus in terms of biology and vision to a certain extent about how color processing works, but we don't have a great sense of how that biology, there's light coming into the eye and then the brain is processing it. And we know how that process works, but we don't understand the amount of variation really in how different people see color. And then on top of that, you have to add in all the variation in terms of how different people conceive of color. So there's the perception and then there's the conception of color. So I might see something that, well, my father very famously once referred to a car as being grayish, tannish, sort of, as color. And my mom and I looked at him and said, no, it's light blue, right? So he had a different way of describing seeing a color that we thought was very obvious. So there's certainly a lot of subjectivity in terms of how colors are described and perceived. One of the other things that's complicated with color is that there are also color effects that are not necessarily, that sort of come about through visual tricks in a way. What I mean when I say that is that there are cases where sort of optical or visual illusions where you can see a color that isn't technically present. And the best example I can give of that is when you are looking at certain high contrast images and look away at a white screen and then end up seeing maybe red where you had been seeing green, or you see black where you had been seeing high contrast or whatever. So, and I'm not familiar with the term optical blue. That's a new one for me, but there have been some discussions in Southwest archaeology about things like, for example, is black and white fine lined hatched lines, is that something that potters might have used to stand in for the color blue in ceramics? Because it's very difficult with the technology available in the Southwest in pre-Hispanic times. People weren't able to fire ceramics with blue pigment on them. So they may have been using black and white fine stripes essentially as a kind of a third color, or sort of a blue-green. There's also been some work on membrace pottery, that very famous black and white painted pottery, that some of the bowls, some of the designs, if you spin them, they generate apparent color effects that are not actually present in the black and white images on the vessels themselves. So that doesn't address optical blue and rock art directly, but in terms of color, it's a lot more complicated than we think at first glance. And then actually the final thing I'd say about color then is that as Dave was referring to, that there are effects that are related to color that aren't technically color, like iridescence or shine, that also can be quite important to viewers. And so these are other aspects of colorful materials that we need to take into account.
Great, thank you. Is there, speaking along those lines, is there any evidence of the use of indigo in the prehistoric Pueblo Southwest? If not, any idea when it arrived to the Southwest?
Well, I see Lori Webster, who's the expert on textiles in the Southwest, and I'm wondering if she can unmute and join in on this one. Are you up for this, Lori? She's looking for the mute button. But so I'll just start out with the poor preservation of textiles in the Southwest is a real problem. We just don't have a lot of textiles, even though we know that people made a lot of textiles. They did a lot of weaving and dyeing, and they painted some textiles, and they tie-dyed some textiles. And I see Janet Cantley's question about that in the chat. So this ties in because in Mesoamerica, blue from indigo, from the plant called indigo, is used to tie-dye textiles in Mesoamerica, and we think that's related to what's going on in the Southwest. But is that right, Lori? We just have a hard time with preservation and with testing for chemically identifying indigo.
Yeah, there hasn't been that much identification done, but it looks like all the indigo in the Southwest is south of the Mogollon Rim, and it's coming up from Mexico. And I think the question in my mind is whether people are actually growing the plant and processing the dye in the Southwest, or if they are importing indigo colored yarns from Mexico. Right now, I think that's a little more probable. There is one tie-dye, or it's actually more of a batik kind of resist dye textile from Casa Grande in southern Arizona. The background is blue. And I'm actually trying to get permission from the Smithsonian to analyze the color on that to see if it's indigo, but I think it probably is. So, but it's a very important color, but we see it historically in the Southwest all over the place, but that's because after Spanish contact, it was imported up from Mexico, a lump form where people could process it a lot easier. It's a very tricky dye to use. You don't just put the leaves in a bath and put your textile in. You have to do a bunch of chemical treatments to get the color to come out.
So it involves fermentation and urine and
oxidation. It comes
oxidation.
out of the yellow and it turns blue before your eyes. So it's magical dye.
I think this transformation of color had to have been really important. I skipped over in the pottery when I showed the polychrome, the orange polychrome with the red stripes that were outlined in black. Those red stripes would have been yellow when they painted them on. The clay would have been gray, and those stripes would have been a yellow limonite. And then when they fire it above ground with oxygen and the iron oxidizes, you get a bright, bright red. So yellow is turning to red in the fire, and the gray is turning to orange. And I think people were probably very, very interested in these transformations. And so the indigo dye changing color with this elaborate process that you have to follow to get that transformation. I think that would have been significant. Should we go to Janet's tie-dye questions? So I'm wearing my tie-dye t-shirt, which is not indigo. It's something much cheaper. This is something that Lori invited me to work with her on investigating. a long time ago, and I think we're on our third, we just published our third article on tie-dye in the Southwest. Looking, we find pictures of tie-dye textiles on pottery. We find it in petroglyphs, especially in the petrified forest area, in kiva murals at Pottery Mound, which is near Albuquerque, and then also in kiva murals at in the Hopi area. And this is something that well, I should let Lori, but this technique may start much earlier in South America and come up the West Coast into West Mexico, and you see it in Central Mexico. Very important tie-dye blankets as tribute items into the Aztec Empire. So a very interesting network of images and techniques. And again, this can't have been easy to do, right?
And I'll just plug the article that we published, I think in 2006, which was Kelley, Polly Shaftsma, and me on tie-dye in the Southwest. So it's a good overview if people are interested in the topic.
So that's in Kiva,
In Kiva, yeah.
Journal of the Arizona Archaeological and Historical Society. And then we just did another one this year that's in the New Mexico Archaeological Society, papers in honor of Mike Marshall, who's a Chaco archaeologist. And we started with the kiva murals at Pottery Mound that Mike Marshall's very interested in, and moved into the textiles and the petroglyphs.
I guess the only thing I'd add about it is that it's not just a technique to create a design. It's a technique that was used to create particular kinds of motifs that had a lot of spiritual importance. So the technique was a means to create the iconography that was a religious iconography.
So the corn imagery, the dot in square patterns today are said to represent corn.
And serpent skin.
Serpent skin in Mesoamerica, but also here probably, and turquoise mosaic, so it ties into some of the artifacts that David was showing. So it would be jade mosaic in the Maya area, and turquoise mosaic or beads up here. What's next?
Great, I have another one. Where do you all see the research going?
So Marit, take that one.
Hey, thanks, Kelley. I mean, I think one of the things that was interesting about working on this project is that it was very clear to us early on that there's a lot of interest in color. This started out as a session at the Society for American Archaeology meetings quite some time ago. I think it was possibly in 2012. And one of the things that I found when I was putting that first group of papers together and asking people to contribute is that a lot of people thought color was sort of interesting, but there hadn't been much of an attempt to bring things together systematically. So what I would say is that with this book, what we tried to do is assemble a big picture of sort of who was using what kinds of colors where and when, and then to start to talk about what those patterns that we found might mean. But it's kind of amazing when you think about that compared to other archaeological research. We're talking about just sort of pulling together the existing literature and then starting to move forward. And that starting to move forward means that there's a lot of ground left to cover. So for example, it would be great if everyone would systematically record Munsell values for all of the colorful items they find in the field, for example. It would be great for people to do a lot more work in museum collections. And some of that work needs to focus on things like identifying really specific characteristics of materials so we can start to talk about things like geographic sources. So, you know, not all red ochre is equal. There are red pigments that might look the same and they end up being quite different based on where they come from. But we can't talk about those locations and the ways in which those locations add meaning to the material until we have a better sense of sources and how pigments from those sources are used and distributed across the Southwest. So there's things about sourcing to do. There's a lot of really interesting things we could learn from talking to and learning from contemporary artists who are working with, and in some cases, reviving old materials. There's a lot of technical knowledge that goes into making paint and dye. Indigo is one extreme example of a tricky dye, but even relatively straightforward dyes and paints require a lot of technical knowledge. And I think we could learn a lot through experimental archaeology and also through talking to contemporary artists who have learned how to make use of these materials. So those are sort of the two main areas that I would point towards right off the bat. Kelley, did you have anything you wanted to add to that, or is that a good start for now?
I think that's a great start, especially talking with people who actually do this work. I have a couple of replicas with me. This is a replica Hopi yellowware pot fired with coal by a Hopi artist named Bobby Silas, who loves to work with museum collections. And he's really interested in how do you get not just a flat yellow color, but this blush, all of the orange and peach and what potters call orange modeling. And then he's using a spattered red paint on the inside. And, you know, every technique that he sees the potters of the past used, he'll figure out how to do that. And his knowledge is just extraordinary. And up in the Mesa Verde area, you have Clint Swink learning to make the black on white pottery with organic paints. And it took him a long time to figure that out. It was really complicated. They had to really want a good clear black on a very bright white, unlike potters in the Prescott area where they just sort of finger painted some black on gray pottery. You know, these colors clearly were important in different ways to different communities. And then the Rio Grande glazeware pottery is another technology. And there's been lots of work done on sourcing the lead to the Cerrillos Hills and other sources that will go glassy when you fire it outside. But this shiny quality to a black to green and sometimes almost purple had to have been very significant, very difficult to make. And this stuff was traded almost as widely as the Hopi yellowware. So people had this knowledge of how to make it, and they were distributing it far and wide, and other communities wanted these very colorful pots. And I'm talking mostly of the 1300s and 1400s. So there's already a lot of work being done in that area of Rio Grande glazeware pottery, and I think there's a lot more to be done there as well.
Kelley, Helen's asked if she can get the name, email, or web pages of the artists that you just mentioned.
Sure, I'll put it in the chat.
Great, thank you.
Oh, I don't know, I can't remember who made the Rio Grande glazeware pot. Unfortunately, I meant to look that up. Eric Blindman knows who did it, but I didn't write it down and keep it in close proximity to the pot. But I'll put Bobby Silas, and he is represented by the King Gallery in Santa Fe.
While you're doing that, does anybody else have any other questions?
If I could go and talk a little bit about where I see things going. One of my interests is lithics analysis. My dissertation was on looking at how communities of practice utilize lithics differently, and whether or not we could tie in chocolate migration into the Middle San Juan region and all that fun stuff. But one of the questions I asked was whether or not people were intentionally heat treating certain materials in order to get that pink orange color that we see from Narbona Pass. And it's just in my analysis of existing literature, it was just something that hasn't really been questioned. And other people actually were like, well, why would you even be curious about this question? And like, well, because we see this heat treatment, this color change as an aspect of multiple cultures. We do it today. When you go and buy jewelry, amethyst could be heat treated citrine, and blue topaz could be heat treated yellow or brown topaz. So it's something that we currently do today, and we find it meaningful even if we don't fully appreciate it. So, you know, I would like to see people begin recording the incidences and the percentages of heat treated charts and silicified woods and whatnot, in order to see whether or not this was something that was being done intentionally, or perhaps it was just an accident of, you know, materials landing too close to a fire.
Okay, if we don't have any other questions, I want to thank our speakers for coming today and enlightening us about color. And I want to thank the audience for participating and joining us. Again, this will be a recorded version on the web page for the press under the author's book. We appreciate everybody being here, and we thank you so much. And the book is available for sale with a discount and free shipping, so check that out if you'd like. Hannah, do you have anything else?
That's it. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks so much. We'll say goodbye now.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks.